I'd like to welcome everyone joining the Beyond podcast today. Thanks for listening in. It's my real pleasure today to have Jonathan Kokil Mangan in the show. He is a very experienced strategy professional. He was a chief strategy officer at Pearson, world's largest education company. But lately, he is the chief strategy and transformation officer at BSI. And for those of you who don't know BSI, it's a British standards institution, which basically helps businesses and equips businesses with the necessary solutions to turn standards of best practice into habits of excellence. And how that works, I think we'll learn a lot more today. And of course, also what that might have to do with the world of consulting. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's very good to be here.
Absolute pleasure. And John, we of course, we spoke before. Maybe to get started, what brought you into the world of standards? What keeps you excited about it?
Yeah, it was a circuitous route. I started my career as an aerospace engineer, actually working in military aerospace, working on air-to-air missiles. This was in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. And so standards are used in engineering, whether it's product standards about how you manufacture safe aerospace equipment, manufacturing standards about safety within the workplace. So I was familiar with standards, but I saw them as something we had to live with, we had to work within. So I was aware of them. I then went into consulting and again was sort of aware of standards, ISO 9000, which is the quality management standards that most consulting firms adhere to, particularly if you do any work at all in the public sector. So I'd come across them, but I'd never really thought about them much. Then I was, when I left Pearson, I decided to leave Pearson and take a sabbatical. My family call it a year off, but I call it a sabbatical because it sounds better. And in the process of that, I was introduced to the then new CEO of BSI, who was looking for some advisory support on strategy. So I did a bit of consulting work for BSI and really, really enjoyed it and completely changed my view of what standards were about. They weren't a constraint, they were an enabler of innovation, which I can come back to. And I found myself becoming quite excited about standards, which I didn't think was going to happen in my life. And then when the CEO and chairman asked me to join to join BSI as their chief strategy officer, it felt like a really, really obvious choice. So I sort of fell into it in many ways, but had been aware of standards my whole career.
Mm-hmm. And tell us a bit more. What is BSI? What is the mission that you embarked on?
So it is a fascinating organisation. So firstly, the way we're structured. So we are a company by royal charter. What that means is basically we don't have shareholders, we don't have owners, but we're not a charity. So for those listeners in the UK, for example, we are very similar to the BBC. So they are another company by royal charter. So a company by royal charter is set up at, weirdly, the gift of the king in current parlance, but must have a purpose. So we exist to fulfill a specific purpose, and that purpose is as a national standards body. So we help create the standards for the country in certain areas, and to play on an international stage. But it's really about making sure that best practices are shared across businesses. And so we fulfill that purpose as our goal. If we are deemed not to fulfill that purpose, we can have our charter withdrawn by the king. Now, it's a very, very tortuous process. I think he's got a lot of things on his mind at the moment. Whether BSI is fulfilling its purpose probably isn't particularly high on his list. But what it means in terms of our culture and in terms of how we approach our strategy, it means that we are very, very purpose driven. So my board are as interested in our impact as they are in our profit. So we are a profit-driven organisation. But we are purpose with profit. So purpose first with profit. We don't distribute the profit. We must, by virtue of our charter, we must reinvest it in our purpose. So that's really, really interesting. So I went from, big FTSE 50 organisation, having to deal with shareholders and all that sort of thing, to not having to do any of that, which is quite nice. But now, very, very focused on the purpose of the organisation. And we describe our purpose as impact for a fair society and a sustainable world. And we do that by creating standards, which I can talk about a bit more, by assuring against those standards. So we certify. Again, for those in the UK, you'll have recognised the kite mark. The kite mark is a BSI mark, which is a certification of a standard, quality standard. We also provide advisory support on those standards as well. So we work across that. And despite being BSI, British Standards, we're a global organisation. So our revenues are about $1 billion. And we're active in about 38 countries around the world. Our biggest countries are actually the US and the UK.
Mhm.
So it's a very surprising organisation.
And I find it fascinating that you say, okay, purpose first, but yet also then comes profit, where
Yeah.
probably in the typical stock listed companies that would be maybe the other way around, or it's equal. But if you say you need to reinvest the profits also completely into your purpose, and you do that through building standards. So my question would be, how do standards actually develop? And being mindful, of course, I work together with a lot of company owners and CEOs, and if I would ask them about standards, often you hear, "Ah, gosh, there is another norm we need to comply with, or another certificate that our some clients ask us to have in order to business with them." So how do standards develop in that way, and also in that way where you reinvest basically into that purpose?
It is a fascinating. So you're right. There are a lot of standards, and certainly my early career was standards were a constraint. So you've got to make the screw threads, for example, that we use across the world in engineering. The definitions of different screws, that is a British standard. It's actually an ISO standard as well, an international standard. But those standards were created by us. But standards are used for all sorts of things. They can be used as a mark of quality or predictability in terms of the output. They can be used for societal reasons, whether that's health and safety. So the most well known, again in the UK probably, is that there is a standard around how glass is made. So many of us grew up staring out the back of our parents' cars with a little kite mark in the window. A little sort of bit looks a bit like a kite. And that means that glass, when it shatters, will always shatter into small pieces. And that's a health and safety. So glass used to be a bit of a Wild West. You could break a piece of glass and it would just break in two and would be incredibly dangerous. And there was a very famous case in the UK where a small child ran through a pane of glass, it cut in half and very badly injured the child. And the standard on glass being able to shatter was then mandated for all glass. So it can be used for that reason. It can be used in trade agreements, for example. So if you want to import, export certain products, to qualify under that trade agreement, they must adhere to a certain standard, for example. And then there are other types of standards that are about helping people reach a level of excellence. And that can be ISO 9000, for example, which is probably certainly the world's most downloaded standard and applied standard. But there are others around how to set up a call center, how to create a purpose-driven business. There's a standard for that. And that isn't something that you must adhere to, it's advisory. And what that means is that we've brought together a load of people, what we call stakeholder-driven standards, experts in a field, who then use a standard way of developing a standard, which I can come back to, and then lay out what they see as best practice in creating a call center or creating a purpose-driven business or whatever. And then that is issued. And sometimes, because of our purpose, we issue those standards for free. So last year, the most downloaded standard for BSI was a standard we wrote on the menopause and helping organisations provide better support for women going through the menopause in the workplace. And we work with a number of organisations to think about how to better provide that sort of support for women, and in so doing, create better organisations. We made that standard free. So we created it ourselves using lots and lots of stakeholders, and then organisations are able to download that and then start to apply it to their own organisations. So there's all sorts of different standards, which makes it more fascinating.
How did that all start? So, I mean, you mentioned there is an expert panel. There are maybe accidents that happen. Out of that comes maybe the need to regulate or to think about how to prevent that in the future. And I know when we first talked, you mentioned that example from 1910 with the railway tracks.
The railway tracks. That's right. So one of the first standards was the width of the railway track. So railway tracks were being laid in the US, around Europe, and no one had really agreed how wide should that railway track be. It was generally thought to be roughly a little bit wider than the front shoulders of a horse, because they expected horses to be pulling these trucks up and down the railways. And some bright spark said, why don't we all agree that the same width for everything, so that we then can have trucks that can go on every railway? And that's a great example of a standard that then drives innovation. So once we've all agreed that, then trade can take off. We can now build railway trucks that will have a much bigger market because they'll fit every railway. And it also is a good example of how standards come about. So it's a recognition that there's a need, often what we call a market. More commonly now, we're looking at net zero, for example. There are all sorts of net zero standards coming out, but it's confusing and we're not able to move forward in terms of innovation. So we're helping to drive net zero standards across the world so that once we have agreed that standard, we can move faster in terms of innovating and achieving the outcome that we're looking for, which is net zero. So it's often market driven. We see a gap. There might be conflicting standards. There might be confusion. There might be a gap entirely. Menopause was one of those, where we're able to say, well, actually, we're perfectly placed because we're completely independent to bring people from all walks of life across the ecosystem, if you will, to agree a standard which can then accelerate innovation and accelerate progress. Mm-hmm. So we have all sort. We create about 2,500 standards, which include updates every year.
And I mean, you've touched on that railway example, where I think it's quite easy to grasp. Makes complete sense to standardize the tracks, and then everyone can build trucks based on these specifications and their interchange. You have a larger market for those. When you think about the world is getting more complex, and there's topics like, I don't know, electric batteries, for example, where also the technology is not, I would say, there yet. I mean, we have made a lot of progress, but also we will make a lot of progress going forward. So it needs to be somewhat open. AI is a similar topic, maybe, where we're right now at the start. Despite all the achievements we have, like there will be exponential growth coming in the next years. So how do you think about creating standards for that? Is that how does it work together with the regulation? How do those more complex topics take shape?
So because of our role as the national standards body, we have very close ties to government. We're very involved in government policy making often, both at a national and international level. So if you take batteries and AI, actually, we work very closely with governments and regulators to start anticipating AI regulations and building standards that can then support them. And deliberately not saying enforce them. Sometimes we're the regulator. I can come back to that in fields like medical devices. But for AI and batteries, which are two very live topics for us, as well as net zero, we work very closely with government bodies, policymakers, to start to think about, well, how can we use standards to direct the progress that will make? So for AI, there's a technical element to AI, which everyone's very familiar with. But there's also, huge debate, and the AI Act is coming in, is in force, but is being updated all the time, about the societal impact of AI, for example. So there's, of course, the bias, there's the use of it, there's a huge carbon implications for AI, how we're going to set it up. But there's societal issues around creating an underclass of people who are just unable to use it. How do we feel about that? About using AI to replace people. The governance of AI should a topic we were dealing with a couple of weeks ago. Should the governance of AI be driven by AI, or should it be humans? Because who's more reliable? We're not sure, actually. And then the final angle that we're looking at, and as you allude to, is that things like AI are moving so fast. By the time you've created a standard, it'll have moved on, it'll be out of date. So we're looking at a different way of looking at developing standards that are, to your point, more flexible. They're always open, so they should be, and that's one of our, as a national standards body, we must make our standards accessible to all on a fair and equal basis across the world. Every country has its own national standards body, who will then form part of the International Standards Organization, ISO, of which we're the founding member of ISO. So the standards sort of roll up into an international mechanism, as well as other standards bodies like IEC, etc. But there's a sense that, we need to make sure that standards are way more digital, way more flexible, can be created and updated continuously, but rigorously. So we have many organizations, for example, who come to us and say, we've got this great idea about how to do strategy, for example, and we'd like to turn our way of doing it into a standard. We're not able to do that because it must be open and accessible. It must be a consensus view. It must be convened, all those sorts of things. But at the same time, we're going through a revolution of standards, because historically standards would take like 2 years to develop. Well, in AI, that's just not going to work. Even in things like batteries, whether it's the nature of the battery itself, the nature of the plug that you put into the car, you can't have lots and lots of different ways of doing it because it'll slow down progress. So there's all sorts of lots of complicated, fascinating issues about how do we move this forward to keep up with the needs of society. And again, I go back to our purpose, which really does drive everything we do: a fair society and a sustainable world. So not fairer, a fair society. How do we use AI to create a fair society and a sustainable world? So it's not just technical, it's all sorts of angles to it.
Can you give maybe, if it's possible, maybe an example of an element, how that AI standard looks like, or what are discussions, like specific points that you think of for everyone to maybe have a bit of a more substantiated feeling? What is an AI standard? Because I find it fascinating to say, okay, well, we look at it, of course, in the UK from a British standpoint. The other countries also do that. How do you then bring that together, where in the country itself it's accelerating? You need to be like, it's happening fast. Standards need to be updated again and again. And how does that cascade into the international theme then? And
Yeah. So ISO is the global standard. So what ISO does is it has members from every country, the national standards body from 120 countries, and what they do is they meet and they look at a particular standard. It might be a British standard, it might be a German standard. To say actually that kind of represents best practice across the world. There's a lot of politics around it, as you can imagine, to say, well, actually, we want to adopt the German standard as the international standard. And that will therefore be the ISO. So it will go from like in the UK, British standards are BS 9750 or whatever. It will then become ISO 9000. And that means that will be used on global trade, global product development, for example. And what it means is that if you are compliant with the ISO standard, you are by definition well, I think, I'm not sure, but you are compliant on a global basis. And so there's lots of discussion about how that happens. The issue really is making sure that it captures everything. So let me give you a quite a specific example. I mentioned medical devices. We do a lot of work on high risk medical devices. So heart valves, hip joints, uh, 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 implants into the brain. All these are very, very technical things. Now, there is a set of standards for medical devices, and if you think about that as a vertical, so medical devices, automotive, high risk manufacturing, all that sort of thing. Increasingly, medical devices have an AI element in there. So a heart monitor, for example, is now obviously has a piece of electronic gadgetry in there. That is now AI enabled. So we're getting feedback from that data, we're learning from that data. And so how do you make sure that the AI bit of that device, so you want to know that that physically won't corrupt the body, that it won't poison the body, that's quite physical. How do you also want to make sure that the AI in there is ethical, it's robust, it's safe, that the data is protected, all those sorts of things. So that is a very specific AI standard. 31,000. So what that standard does is it says the use of AI in those sorts of devices must fall within these sorts of parameters in terms of the security of the data that's coming out of that device, the way it's used, the way it's made available, how it's used by the manufacturer, all that sort of thing. It also has heart device is a good example. Another standard, this is where it becomes complicated, for the battery. So you've got another standard that dictates that how that battery is made, how it fits within the device, how it's maintained, how it lasts, how it's joined up with all the mechanical bits. So you think, oh, I'm going to build a heart device. There are like 10 standards that you've got to fit within. And they're all quite narrow. So there's quite a narrow AI standard in there. It's quite a narrow battery standard. So you don't have an AI standard. You have aspects of AI that are broken down into specific standards. And the trick, and what makes it difficult, and where you've got, to your point, lots of national governments with all their own interests, their own points of view, how do you make sure that that is coherent so that companies aren't sort of sitting there scratching their head trying to figure out, well, I don't know which standard applies. And it's sort of, it might be a bit of this one and a bit of this one. Weirdly, my innovation team are using a form of chat GPT to help people understand which standards they should be using. So we're even using AI to understand AI standards, and the irony is not lost on me. So it's becoming complicated, which is why it's really important that within the standards community, we're making this as straightforward as possible to fulfill our purpose. Because if it becomes too complicated, eventually people go, this is too hard, I can't be bothered, I'm just going to ignore them. And then we don't have safe products, we don't have effective products, we have a bit of a Wild West out there, and then we don't have safety, for our consumers. So we monitor in terms of our impact on medical devices, for example, how many patients of our lives are better as a result of the devices that we help certify. How much carbon are our clients saving as a result of implementing our carbon-related standards? How much water is being conserved? Or how much waste is being reduced? So we're very focused on the application of each standard having an impact, and then understanding, so how much impact have our standards had on the world? If you've got multiple complex standards and you can't figure it out, then you can't figure out your impact. And we have to know our impact.
Which I really find fascinating. When you put yourself in the shoes of CEOs, executives, thinking about how should I, or what standards should I implement at my company, yeah, certainly it comes maybe also with a cost attached, but it comes maybe also with a benefit attached. How should I navigate that space as an executive? And when you develop the standards, do you keep these costs that companies potentially would face? Or maybe you say, okay, there's a new standard. Some companies do not yet reply with it, might be driven out of the market or need to significantly revamp their productions. How does it work? How should company leaders navigate that space?
It's a great question. One of the things I often say across the business to our staff, I've worked in many organisations, sitting in the C-suite of many of them, and I can honestly say at no point in any meeting has anyone said, oh, we could do with a good standard today. Says nobody ever. But they might have a lot of really complicated problems. So let me give you an example from my days in education when I was at Pearson. So Pearson, largest education company in the world, creating textbooks and courseware for universities and schools and beyond in the workplace. And one of the problems that we had is we had lots and lots and lots of data. We knew lots about our learners. We knew what they were studying, what they knew, what they liked, what they didn't like. And then we had Google, which had lots and lots and lots of data about those learners as well, in terms of their interests, how they thought about the world. And then we had universities. And universities, of course, had lots and lots of data about the learners. And we would sit there and think, wouldn't it be great if we could share that data in a way where we all trust each other? Because if we could put all that data together, the products we could design for learners to move their careers forward would be truly incredible. The problem we had was that universities didn't trust anybody with their data. Nobody trusted Pearson because it was a big conglomerate. Google wasn't trusted either. So what we could have done is created a standard to say, look, we're going to share our data using an independent standard that will drive trust. And if you want to be part of our ecosystem, you apply to this, and your data is put together and managed in this standardized way, then we can access all this data in a safe way that we all trust each other and therefore create amazing products for learners. And the point there is it isn't the standard that you need to worry about. It's the business outcome that you want to achieve. So, for example, many organizations are sitting in the boardroom thinking, we're spending a lot on AI or sustainability. How do I know we're spending money in the right places? How do I know I'm getting the right impact from that spend? So I'm doing all these things that consultants are out there saying, you should do X, you should do Y, you should do Z. But they're sort of incentivized for me to want to do all of those things. We're not incentivized for you to do those things. So we create a standard that says, look, best practice in how to get to net zero is this. So, for example, I'm a big rugby fan, and I had the opportunity to talk to the CEO of my local rugby team, and I said, look, I don't think it's very good that when I buy my beer, I buy it in a single-use plastic. Did you know there's a standard that you can apply to every event that will help move you to a net zero event? And actually, it's a document. You download the document. You have to pay to download it, but it's not a lot. And you can then apply that, and you could move towards a net zero event. And your supporters would really like that. You would like that because actually it does work out cheaper. So the outcome isn't the standard. The standard is the enabler of an outcome. So whether you want to achieve a net zero event, and we use that particular standard is used at Grand Prix, it's used at NFL games in the US, it's used at football stadia. If you want to have more, retain women in the workplace, particularly as they're going through menopause, there's a way of doing that's been agreed, that lots and lots of experts have come together and they can do that. So my advice isn't really find out which standard, it's find out what the problem is, and then maybe go onto our website and use that as the basis of understanding which standards can help me achieve this outcome. I want to use AI safely. I want to use it in a way that doesn't ruin my relationship with my customers. How do I do that? And we have tools that enable you, standards navigation, we call it, to say, actually, well, these standards would really help you achieve that outcome.
Thinking from the outcome, and what you mentioned there is, of course, consultants around it. You, I think, provide also maybe advice on what standards might be useful for certain outcomes that you want to achieve as a business leader. What role do consultants play in the enforcement or the implementation of standards?
So as a former consultant, I wish I'd known a lot more about standards. So things like, as consultant, I would get asked, I want to create a more purpose-driven business. How do I do that? Well, there's a standard that's been written about how you could create a more purpose-driven organization. I really want to improve the performance of our call centers. There's a standard for that. And that's a good starting point. So you could say, well, actually, we could work off this standard. We could help the client implement this standard. And it's a relatively tried and tested way of working. And those are both standards that aren't certifiable. You don't have to comply. It's just to get you going. So it's a very good start to think, well, okay, what is best practice, or sometimes not best practice, but good practice around call centers? Let's see how we compare to that. So it's a very good tool if I were a consultant, again, to think, well, I could test where we are against this standard and identify where the biggest gaps are. So how do I prioritize? Where do I go next? I could use the standard in some instances. So that there's advice on which standards. I think that the more interesting opportunity is then, once you find out which standard would apply, how do you help the client learn from that standard, prioritize the changes they want to make, and move them forward? So it's a good, we use a phrase in the UK, starter for 10. It sort of gets you going in all sorts of areas. And then, our head of standards in our exco meetings, the number of times we have a conversation and he'll pipe up and go, there's a standard for that, because there's a standard for virtually everything. So it's worth understanding what's out there, and they're not all product standards. As I said, there's lots of process standards, what we call system standards as well.
So starting from the business problem, let's say, the outcome that you want to have, and then seeing what standards could help you as a starting point to validate against and to start, basically.
Yeah. So we do it ourselves. We use our own standards, which is a relief. I'm also responsible for our own sustainability. So the Chief Sustainability Officer is part of my team, and she does her double materiality assessment every year, and out of that we end up with our priorities. And for a business like ours, it's largely about carbon, a bit about water, a bit about circularity. We then figure out, well, which standards should we apply that will help us make progress in those areas. So we took our DMA, we then found out which are the standards that would help us do that. We're now applying those standards to improve our sustainability.
Jonathan, thank you very much for sharing. Yeah, because you're also a very, very busy person. There is a last section I want to run through with you, which is a bit of a rapid fire thing. And we talked a lot about standards, and you mentioned, along with the BSI, you have more than 2,500 standards. And you, of course, on a daily basis must come across a lot more. What's the funniest standard you've ever came across?
I mean, there are literally thousands. We have a product testing site in Hemel Hempstead in the UK, and we are, I think this is the case. We are the world's. We have cornered the market in condom testing, and so we test about 1,000 condoms a day, and you can go up to our lab. And we have someone that's been working in this business for about 12 years, and his job is basically to explode condoms every day. That's what he does. He's incredibly good at it. And then what we work out is, as it explodes, what happens. And when we start tours, we test windows, we test fire extinguishers, we test all sorts of things. But we start every single tour with taking them into the lab, and we don't tell them what it is. And you can see visitors thinking, is that a condom there you're testing? It's like, yeah, we are. We are the world's #1 condom tester.
Okay. Amazing. Are there any... I didn't know
That
about
wasn't
it.
the answer you were expecting, was it?
Yeah. Are there any standards where you think, okay, look, the world is getting more complex, we're getting more and more standards, it's happening faster. What standards would you eliminate if you could?
There are a lot of standards I'd update. And I think, feedback from our clients, particularly around IT security. I think there are standards that I wouldn't eliminate, but I think we are very actively thinking about how to move faster in those worlds. I don't think there are any that I'd eliminate. There are standards I see that aren't our standards that I think, what's the point of that? I did actually see a proposal recently, I don't know whether it was a joke or not, but about when you go into cafes, what is the right angle of a cake slice? So you buy a slice. I'm not sure we need a standard on that. I think we should leave that up to the delicatessen or whatever. So some people do get very upset about that. I think there are some standards that you have to be very careful about. So partly because of the liability. So, there's a lot of mental health standards that are emerging. I think you have to be very careful about mandating mental health standards on organizations, because who's liable? So one of the issues that we do have within standards is if you apply a standard and something goes wrong, for whatever reason, you need to understand liability. So there's some of those. So that's the serious answer. The more flippant answer is we definitely do not need a standard on how big a slice of cake should be.
Gotcha. Would you recommend any books for our listeners, for executives, to get more in the topic, or to really get a better understanding of how to apply or use standards to make your business thrive?
Yeah, this was a hard one because there aren't, if there are standards books, I haven't read them. I mean, I get enough of standards during my day as it is. There are some very interesting reports about trust. The World Economic Forum has recently produced an interesting report on the nature of trust within the business world. And in there is a lot about the role standards should be playing. That was a good read. And a lot as well is included. One of the things that's very interesting, I'm very interested in, is the UK, but a lot of countries are now sort of realizing they need an industrial strategy. We haven't been very good at those. The role that standards can play in driving industrial strategies, industry strategies, is really significant. So they're not specifically about standards, but they start to get your thought processes going on how could standards drive things like industry strategy on a national and international level. So not as exciting a book as I'd love to be able to recommend, but yeah. The real thing about standards, it's about trust. So when there's a standard in place, you as a consumer trust that company, or you as a citizen trust the community or the government. So I read quite a lot of books that are sort of about how to drive trust in organisations.
Yeah, and I think that is a great last word also, that the trust is the most important thing driving it. If you want, let me know the link to that World Economic Forum, and we can also post it in the
Great.
comments
Yeah.
of the podcast to share it. Jonathan, thank you very much for joining today. It's been my pleasure.
My
And
pleasure too.
really interesting to learn more about the world of standards and how they drive businesses.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.